Namo Ramana. A very warm welcome to all the devotees for Raman Kendra Delhi's Sunday Satsang with Raghav ji. I shall now request Narayananji to initiate puja. Sir.
शुक्लांबरधरं विष्णुं च शिवन्नं चतुर्भुजं प्रसन्नवदनं ध्याये सर्वविघ्नोपशान्ते अयमूर्तसमुत्सर्गोऽसुन्दो बन्धो न प्रणन्दो अयमूर्तसमुत्सर्गोऽस्तु तदेव लग्नं सदिनं तदेव ताराबलं चन्द्रबलं तदेव विद्याबलं दैवबलं तदेव लक्ष्मीं वेद्यते गिरिं स्मरामि ॐ भो ॐ भुव ॐ सुव ॐ मः ॐ जन ॐ तव ॐ सत्यम् ओम तत्सौदर्ववर्ण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो न प्रचोदयात् ओमाव ज्योतिर्समृतं ब्रह्मोत्सरो नमोपात समस्त दुर्द सहत्वारा श्री परमेश्वर प्रीत्यर्थम निर्विदाशमाण कर्मणः निर्विण्णप्रसादं माधव दिग्विजय पूजा करके पृथ्वी मेरुं से सूर्य चंद्रमा देवता पृथ्वी दियात्रदा लोकादेवतं विष्णुनाथदा स्वयं सहतारे मां देवी पुत्रम आगमार्थम तु देवानां कमनार्थम तु रक्षातां कंडारणं कराम यादव देवतवानदांजनम अमोपात समस्त दुर्द चैतवारा श्री परमेश्वर की चित्तम निर्बंधा सिद्धत्त माधव विघ्नेश्वर पूजा करके गणानाथा गणपति को मवामे कविंग भीनाम मस्तोत्तरमं ज्येष्ठराजं ब्रह्मणां ब्रह्मणस्पदे साधनम में महागणपति महागणपति आवाहयामि ओम महागणपति नमः समर्पयामि ओम महागणपति नमः अर्घ्यं समर्पयामि ओम महागणपति नमः पाद्यं समर्पयामि ओम महागणपति नमः स्मरणीयं समर्पयामि ओम महागणपति नमः औपचारिकस्नानं समर्पयामि ओम महागणपति नमः स्नानानन्तरमास्मक्यं समर्पयामि ओम महागणपति नमः वस्त्रदातं अक्षतां समर्पयामि ओम महागणपति नमः यज्ञोपवीतार्थं अक्षतां समर्पयामि ओम महागणपति नमः गंगा धारयामि समर्पयामि ओम महागणपति नमः गंधोपरि अक्षतां समर्पयामि ओम महागणपति नमः अलंकरणार्थं अक्षतां समर्पयामि ओम महागणपति नमः हरिद्रा कुंकुमं समर्पयामि ओम महागणपति नमः पुष्पै पूजयामि ओम सुमुदाय नमः ओम एकदंताय नमः ओम कपिलाय नमः ओम गजकर्णकाय नमः ओम लंबोदराय नमः ओम विगडाय नमः ओम विघ्नराजाय नमः ओम विनायकाय नमः ओम धूमकेतवे नमः ओम गणतक्षाय नमः ओम बालचंद्राय नमः ओम गजाननाय नमः ओम वक्रतुंडाय नमः ओम शूर्पकर्णाय नमः ओम हेरंबाय नमः ओम स्कंदमूर्धवाय नमः ओम सिद्धविनायकरे नमः ओम शंकरमोक्ष विनायकरे नमः ओम मातुपुर विनायकरे नमः ओम महागणपतिये नमः नानाविधपरिमलपत्रपुष्पाणि समर्पयामि। धूपार्थं समर्पयामि। दीपार्थं समर्पयामि। अक्षदां समर्पयामि। ॐ भूर्भुवस्सुः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो न प्रचोदयात्। देवदत्तप्रसवसत्यं दर्शनप्रसन्नं अमृतोपमं स्वाहा। ॐ प्राणाय स्वाहा, ॐ अपानाय ज्ञानाय स्वाहा, उदानाय स्वाहा, ॐ समानाय स्वाहा, ब्रह्मणे स्वाहा। महागणपतये नमः, महागणपतये नमः, महागणपतये नमः। नाट्यचक्रे नैवेद्यं समर्पयामि। मध्ये मध्ये पानीयं समर्पयामि। अमृतं सूत्रावसं समर्पयामि। कर्पूरं समर्पयामि। नमो नमो गणेशाय नमस्ते विश्वरूपणे निर्विघ्नं गुरुवेदार्यं नमामितं गजाननं अभिजातवसुमार्गं गजाननमहार्निशम् अनेकदन्तं भक्तानाम् एकदन्तम् उपास्महे। महागणपतये नमः, महागणपतये नमः, महागणपतये नमः। कर्पूरं समर्पयामि। नीराजनं समर्पयामि। नीराजनानन्तरम् आसमनीयं समर्पयामि। महागणपतये नमः, महागणपतये नमः, महागणपतये नमः। वक्रतुण्ड महाकाय सूर्यकोटिसमप्रभ निर्विघ्नं कुरु मे देव सर्वकार्येषु सर्वदा। गणपतिप्रसादं शिरसा प्रणमामि। ओम ओम भुव ओम सुव ओम मह ओम जन ओम तव ओम सत्यम ओम तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो न प्रचोदयात्। ओम अवज्योतिषं अमोपात समस्त दुर्ग चात्मारा परमेश्वर प्रीत्यर्थम शुभे शोभने मूर्ते आद्य ब्रह्मण विद्ये परार्थे श्रीवेदे वराकल्पे वैवस्वतमन्वन्तरे अष्टाविंशतितमे कलियुगे प्रथमे पादे जम्बूद्वीपे भारतवर्षे भरतखण्डे मेरु दक्षिणे पार्श्वे सदाब्दे अस्मिन् वर्तमाने यावावृकेः रव्वादीनां तस्य संवत्सराणां मध्ये शोभदृतुनाम संवत्सरे उत्तरायणे वसंत ऋतु ऋषभमासे शुक्लपक्षे नवमी तिथ्यां शुभतिथौ भानुवासयुक्तायां पूर्वफल्गुनी नक्षत्रयुक्तायां शुभनक्षत्र शुभयोग शुभकर्ण एवं गुण विशेषण विशिष्टायाम् अस्यां नवमी तिथ्यां शुभतिथौ मम जन्म पप्रति एतक्षणपर्यन्तं मध्ये सम्भाविधानं सर्वेषां भावानां सत्य अवनोदनार्थम् अस्माहं सहकुर्मानं क्षेमसद्धर्य वीर्य विजय आयुरारोग्य ऐश्वर्याणाम् अभिवृद्ध्यर्थं समस्तमङ्गलाभ्यर्थं समस्तदुर्गोपजातयार्थं रमणमहर्षेः प्रसादेन ज्ञानवैराग्यसिद्ध्यर्थं श्री रमणमहर्षेः पूजां करिष्ये। तदंगम कलश पूजां च करिष्ये। विघ्नेश्वरं यथास्थानं प्रतिष्ठापयामि। शोभनार्थे क्षेमाय पुनरागमनाय च। कलशस्य मुखे विष्णुकण्ठे रुद्रसमाधिस्थ मूले तत्र सिद्धितो ब्रह्मा मातृगणे समृता कुशौ सुसागरा सर्वे सप्तद्विभागसुन्दरा ऋग्वेदो यजुर्वेदो सामवेदोपाधर्मण गंगे सैन्य गोदावरी सरस्वती नर्मदे सिंधु कावेरी जगेस्मिन् सन्निधं कुरु। अंगैः सहिता सर्वे करताम्बुसमाचित्ता आयान्तु देवपूजार्थं दुर्दर्शकारः। अंगूरा सागरोत्पन्नो विष्णा विष्णुकरे देवे सद्भुते देवे पाजने नमोस्तुते देवो देवालय प्रोक्त जीव देव स्नान अंजार निर्माल्यम सोयांगोने पूजे ओम सकल गुणात्म शक्तियुक्ता योग पीडात्मने नमः आधार शक्तिये नमः मूल प्रकृतिये नमः आदिवराय नमः आदिगुरुमाय नमः अनंताय नमः पृथ्व्यै नमः आदित्यादि नवग्रह देवताभ्यो नमः दश दिग्बालेभ्यो नमः गुरुर्ब्रह्मा गुरुर्विष्णु गुरुर्देवो महेश्वरा गुरु साक्षात् परब्रह्म तस्मै श्री गुरवे नमः ओम अस्य श्री प्राणविष्टा मंत्रस्य ब्रह्मा विष्णु महेश्वर ऋषेण चिकित्सा मदनवाणी संतांसी सकल जगत स्थिति संहारकारिणी प्राणशक्ति परादेवता आम बीजम हरिम शक्ति क्रोम कीलकम प्राण प्रतिष्ठापने विनियोग आम अंगुष्ठाभ्यां नमः हरितर्जनीभ्यां नमः क्रोम मध्यमाभ्यां नमः आमनाव्याभ्यां नमः हरिकंष्टिकाभ्यां नमः क्रोम कर्णकुष्ठाभ्यां नमः आम हृदयाय नमः हरिं शिरसे स्वाहा क्रोम शिगाय वसट आम कौसायम हरिं नेत्रताय वसट क्रोम अस्त्रताय पट पूर्वसुर दिग्बंध ध्यानम रक्तांबोधिष्ठ बोधोलस करुणगणकराक्षे पासंगोदंडम इक्षुत्व मणिमण पंचमानात् विप्राणुष कपालंतने रचता पिनवसर्वट्या देवी बालर्गौणा बहुसुगरिपागतिपरान ओम आम हरिं क्रोम क्रोम हरिं आम अम्यम रमलम वंशम सम्म अंश स्वम स्वम अंश अस्यामृतौ दिवदुच्चतो अस्यामृतौ सर्वे क्रियाणि वामनस्वस्तोत्र दिव्या प्राणभाग पाणिपाद वायुभूस्थानि या कस्ति स्वस्ति सुदं दृष्टन्तु स्वाहा ओम अस्य श्री प्राणविष्टामस्य ब्रह्मा विष्णु महेश्वर ऋषि चिकित्सा मदनवाणी संतांसी सकल जगत स्थिति संहारकारिणी प्राणशक्ति परादेवता आम बीजम हरिं शक्ति क्रोम कीलकम प्राण प्रतिष्ठापने विनियोग आम अंगुष्ठाभ्यां नमः हरितर्जनीभ्यां नमः क्रोम मध्यमाभ्यां नमः आमनाव्याभ्यां नमः हरिकंष्टिकाभ्यां नमः क्रोम कर्णकुष्ठाभ्यां नमः आम हृदयाय नमः हरिं शिरसे स्वाहा क्रोम शिगाय वसट आम कौसायम हरिं नेत्रदाय वसट क्रोम अस्त्रदाय पट पूर्वस्वर दिग्बंध असुनीरे पुनस्पाक्ष सक्ष पुनः प्राणमयिनो दैवोगम योग पश्येन्द्र सूर्य मुच्यतम नर्मदे बलियान शक्ति आवायुधो भव श्रद्धायुधो भव सन्निधो भव सन्निधो भव अवगुंडितो भव सुब्रतो भव सुब्रसन्नो भव सुमुखो भव वरदो भव प्रसिद्ध प्रसिद्ध स्वामी सर्वजगन्नाथ यावत् पूजावसानकं तावत् प्रतिभावेन दिव्येस्मिन् सन्निधं गुरु ओम भूर्भुवस्सुवः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो न प्रचोदयात् देवदूतस्य सत्यं वदनेन प्रसन्नामि अमृतस्त्वं स्वाहा ओम प्राणाय स्वाहा ओम अपानाय स्वाहा ओम ज्ञानाय स्वाहा ओम उदानाय स्वाहा ओम समानाय स्वाहा ओम ब्रह्मणे स्वाहा ओम नमो भगवते की अर्णाचुतिरमणाय नमः ओम नमो भगवते की अर्णाचुतिरमणाय नमः नमो भगवते की अर्णाचुतिरमणाय नमः नटराजने नमः भैरवने नमः नंदी वैश्वराय नमः शिव पार्वतीये नमः ओम नमः शिवाय नमः शिवाय नमः ओम नमः शिवाय नमः शिवाय नमः ओम नमः शिवाय नमः शिवाय नमः नाट्यचक्रे नित्यं समर्पयामि मध्ये मध्ये पानीयं समर्पयामि अमृतोपचारोत्तरावसं समर्पयामि नीराजनं समर्पयामि नीराजनानन्तरं आस्मनीयं समर्पयामि रिसाइट भगवान स्तोत्रम मंगलम एक वर्ष भगवान श्री गुरुभ्यो नमः गुरु ब्रह्मा गुरु विष्णु गुरुदेव महेश्वर गुरु साक्षात् परम ब्रह्म तस्मै श्री गुरवे नमः अभारवत्ति सुगुहारि राशौर्य शौर्यमात्रं भुवनं समस्तं गुहायुधं तं रमणं कबीरं चिन्ताविरणं चिन्तयामि ओम महातेन महोंसेन जाताय नमः ओम श्री रमणाय नमः ओम गुरवे नमः ओम अखंड संविदागराय नमः ओम मौजसे नमः ओम कारणोद्भवाय नमः ओम जगत्पितावताराय नमः ओम श्री भूमिनाथास्तभूतिदाय नमः ओम पराशर कुलोतंसाय नमः। ओम सुंदरातनवपदाय नमः। ओम कमनीय सुचारित्राय नमः। ओम सयायंबा सयायवते नमः। ओम शोणाकुलम भौमलीन मानसाय नमः। ओम स्वर्णस्तकाय नमः। ओम श्रीमद्वादशांत महास्त्रेलप्त विद्योदयाय नमः। ओम महाशक्तिनिवादेन प्रबुद्धाय नमः। ओम परमार्थविदे नमः। ओम दिव्यराय नमः। ओम पितृपदान्वेषिणे नमः। ओम इंदुमूलिना पितृपदे नमः। ओम पितृदेष्ट शोणशैलम प्राप्ताय नमः। ओम तपोमयाय नमः। ओम उदासीनाय नमः। ओम महायोगिने नमः। ओम महोत्साहाय नमः। ओम कुशादित्ये नमः। ओम शांत संकल्प संभ्रमाय नमः। ओम सुकुंद्रुसे नमः। ओम सवित्रे नमः। ओम स्थिराय नमः। ओम तपस्वीर सर्वंगाय नमः। ओम पुल्लापूज विलोचनाय नमः। ओम चंद्रिकाय सिद्धाधि मंडितान मंडलाय नमः। ओम सूदवाट्यां समासीनाय नमः। ओम सूर्यदाकिल विप्रमाय नमः। ओम वेद वेदांतपग्नाय नमः। ओम चिन्मुत्रे नमः। ओम त्रिगुणाधिगाय नमः। ओम विरूपाक्ष भुवाभासाय नमः। ओम विराजत सलाकुये नमः। ओम उच्चित्तनयनाय नमः। ओम पूर्णाय नमः। ओम रसिदासुतांडवाय नमः। ओम गंभीराय नमः। ओम परमाचार्याय नमः। ओम सुब्रतन्याय नमः। ओम अभयप्रदाय नमः। ओम दक्षिणाभिनिवाय नमः। ओम धीराय नमः। ओम दक्षिणाभिमुखाय नमः। ओम स्वराजे नमः। ओम महर्षिये नमः। ओम भगवते नमः। ओम ईट्याय नमः। ओम भूमविद्या विशारदाय नमः। ओम विमलाय नमः। ओम दीर्घदर्शने नमः। ओम आप्ताय नमः। ओम विषमार्ग प्रदर्शकाय नमः। ओम समत्रुसे नमः। ओम सत्यत्रुसे नमः। ओम सत्याय नमः। ओम प्रसादाय नमः। ओम अमित विक्रमाय नमः। ओम सुकुमाराय नमः। ओम सदानंदाय नमः। ओम मृदुभाषिणे नमः। ओम दयार्णवाय नमः। ओम श्री सोमनाथ इरुभूत स्कंदाश्रम निकेतनाय नमः। ओम सत्दर्शनोपदेष्टने नमः। ओम सद्भक्त वृंद परिपूजाय नमः। ओम गणेश मुनिलिंगेन सेवितां विसरोर्वाय नमः। ओम गीतोपदेश सारादि ग्रंथ संशील संशयाय नमः। ओम वर्णाश्र सुमदादीदाय नमः। ओम रसज्ञाय नमः। ओम सौम्याय नमः। ओम आत्मपदे नमः। ओम सर्वावनिपदत्तानां महाराध्याय नमः। ओम सर्वसत्कुलिने नमः। ओम आत्मारामाय नमः। ओम महाभागाय नमः। ओम मातृमुक्तिविदायकाय नमः। ओम विनदाय नमः। ओम विनुदाय नमः। ओम विप्राय नमः। ओम मुनीन्द्राय नमः। ओम भावगोद्वलाय नमः। ओम दर्शनादक सम्मारणे नमः। ओम मौनेन स्वप्न बोधकाय नमः। ओम ईर्ष्यादिकर्षानित्याय नमः। ओम स्फुटात्मन्द मोचकाय नमः। ओम अंतस्मीर झंडाप्तवे नमः। ओम संसारानुगतारकाय नमः। ओम सोनादिष्टरे नमः। ओम अर्थ विद्या प्रकाशकाय नमः। ओम अविच्युत निज प्रज्ञाय नमः। ओम नैसत्य महातंसे नमः। ओम कमंडलुराय नमः। ओम सुप्रगविनवसनाय नमः। ओम गुहाय नमः। ओम दंडवाणे नमः। ओम कृपापूर्णाय नमः। ओम पवरोग पिशक्वराय नमः। ओम स्कंदाय नमः। ओम देवदमाय नमः। ओम अमर्त्याय नमः। ओम सेनानिये नमः। ओम पुरुषोत्तमाय नमः। ओम नमो भगवते श्री अरुणाचल श्री रमणाय नमः। ओम नमो भगवते श्री अरुणाचल श्री रमणाय नमः। नमो भगवते श्री अरुणाचल श्री रमणाय नमः। I will recite Upodesha Saram. कर्तुराज्ञया प्रापदे फलम् कर्मगिम्बरम् कर्मदक्षणम् प्रीतिमानदो तदनकारणम् परमशाश्वतम् गगनिरोधकम् ईश्वरार्पितम् नेचया कृतम् चित्तशोधकम् मुक्तिसाधकम् कायवाङ्मन कार्यमुत्तमम् उत्तमं जव चिन्तनं क्रमात् जगतैषधी युक्तसेवनम् अष्टमूर्तित् देवपूजनम् उत्तमस्तवा उच्चमन्दद चित्तजं जप ज्ञानबुद्धमम् आद्यतारया श्रोतसाधनम् सरलचिन्तनम् विरलतपरम् वेदभावना सोवाङ्गयो भावनाविदा भावनीमदा भावशून्यत भावसुस्तुति भावनाबला भक्तिरुत्तमा इरुष्टरे मन स्वस्थता क्रिया भक्तियोगमो दाचनिश्चितम् वायुरोधना प्रीयते मन जालभक्षिव रोधसाधनम् चित्तवायव चित्क्रियायुधा कागयोर्वयि शक्तिमूलगा लयविनाशने उभयरोधने लयकदं पुनर्भवति मृगम् प्राणवन्दना दीनमानसम् एकचिन्तना नाशमेद्यद नष्टमानसो दृष्टयोगिन कृत्यमस्ति किम् स्वस्तितं यद दृश्यवारितं चित्तमात्मन चित्वदर्शनं तत्वदर्शनं मानसं तुगिं मार्गणे हृदे नैव मानसं मार्गार्जवा वृद्धयस्त्वं वृत्तिमाश्रिता वृद्धयो मनो विद्यां मन अहमयं कुतो भवति चिन्वत ऐपदत्यहं निजविचारणम् अहमिनाशवा अयमहं दया स्फुरतीरस्वयं परमपूर्णसत् इदमहं वदा अभिज्ञमन्वहम् अहमलीनके अत्यल्यसत्यया विक्रयेन्द्रिय प्राणदीतम नामसे सग तज्जडं नच सत्त्ववासिका चित्त्ववेदरा तत्तया इति चित्तयायहम् ईशजीवयो वेशदीपिता तस्वभावदो वस्तु केवलं वेशानद स्वात्मदर्शनम् ईशदर्शनम् स्वात्मरूपत आत्मसंस्थिति स्वात्मदर्शनम् आत्मनिर्भया आत्मनिष्ठता ज्ञानवर्जिता अज्ञानहीनकी ज्ञानहस्तिकिं नादुमन्तरम् किं स्वरूपमे आत्मदर्शने अव्यया भवा पूर्णसित्सुखम् बन्धमुक्त्यदुं तं परं सुखम् विन्ददीयति वस्तुदैविक अहमवेदकम् निजविमानकम् महतितं तवो रमणवागियम् महतितं तवो रमणवागियम् महतितं तवो रमणवागियम्। ओम नमो भगवते श्री अरुणाचल रमणाय। ओम नमो भगवते श्री अरुणाचल श्री रमणाय। ओम नमो भगवते श्री अरुणाचल श्री रमणाय। हरि ओम हरि ओम हरि ओम। ओम नमः शिवाय। Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya.
Namo Ramana. Very warm welcome to all the devotees for today's Satsang at Raman Kendra Delhi with Raghavji. Raghavji, as always, for the last few weeks, he shall be addressing us and speaking on the earliest set of instructions given by Bhagwan in his own handwriting, condensed in the form of Vichara Sangraha or self-inquiry, as preserved by Gambhiram Seshaya. Raghavji, of course, needs no introduction. He has been with us for nearly 2 years now. I shall request him to take over and proceed. Sir, over to you.
Namaste and welcome to this study of the Vichara Sangraha, which, as Anuragji mentioned, are the earliest written instructions of Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi. So there are these 40 odd questions in this text, in which we were studying the question number 12. There was a discussion in the last session about how Bhagavan validates the importance of the words of the Guru. He calls it Shravanam. And these words of the Guru are not another new invention or anything totally divorced from the larger tradition of Advaita. Instead, our Guru only connects us to what is true without really trying to introduce any fresh cultish kind of a feeling. So that is an important aspect of what is known as Shravanam, where our own Guru becomes for us a conduit through which we receive the blessing of self-knowledge. And so Bhagavan mentioned in response to the previous question how these two things which Bhagavan calls as dwelling upon the meaning of the scriptures, that is only through the words of the Guru. Remember, whenever there is talk of scriptures and study and so on, people sometimes follow a course of making it academic and studying it as a kind of intellectual pursuit where it is more for the joy of mere information. Whereas the intention of all the jnanis and our own Guru Bhagavan is that the very words of our Guru are the means to understand the Shastra or scriptures. And then as we dwell upon and understand those very words of the Guru deeper, we are able to come to a point where our own mind gently resolves into its source, which is the self, which is non-dual. And that is what is referred to as establishment or abidance in the self. And Bhagavan therefore refers to that very nididhyasanam as abiding as the very self. Doing, there is no thinking, there is no imagination of any kind in this last and most important phase of self-knowledge, which is nididhyasanam. The aspirant meditates in order to gain the natural state of the mental mode of the form of the self, of the form I am Brahman, which is the result of continued contemplation of Brahman. In other words, Bhagavan clarifies that the very meditation on Brahman is by remaining as Brahman. Unlike meditation on any particular form or idea or concept, meditation on Brahman in the form of Nididhyasanam is to remain as oneself, to remain as the very non-dual self. There is no other doing or thinking involved in that. So Bhagavan is so perfectly restating this very valuable sadhana of Nididhyasanam in a very direct way, saying that the result of continued contemplation on Brahman of the form I am Brahman is what establishes us in the natural state of our being. So this was the essence of the previous question, where the question was, can this limited mind understand his unlimited self or unlimited Brahman? Bhagavan says, yes, surely, because we are not trying to make a concept out of that infinite, merely dissolving as it were into it. And the magic here is that each one of us is never away from that non-dual self. And so what all we are called upon to do is take a little step back, slow down this habitual thinking pattern of taking oneself to be small, taking oneself to be the doer, taking oneself to be experiencing various things in one's life. So these are habitual modes of thinking, and they are so deeply ingrained that we have to talk of a kind of sadhana to undo, to get back to oneself. And so all that Bhagavan asks us to do, therefore, which is easy, at the same time a little subtle. And that subtle sadhana here is to come back and not get carried forward into the thoughts and their stories, which are all based on I am so and so, I do this, and I'm supposed to do this, and I shall make plans for the future. All of these things are all part of the aham karta, I am the doer idea. And unless that I am the doer notion is gradually wound back, as it were, by taking a step back and just letting things be as they are. So one of the things one is asked to do in Nididhyasana, in establishing oneself in the self, is to allow things to be and just be a witness. Okay, that is the first stage. Remember, that's not the last stage. The first stage is to be a witness to what is without reacting, without adding one's own overlay to what is happening. So the more we practice being a witness without reaction, we are already part of the way along this path of self-inquiry. Then is that the end of the story? Okay, we are the witness. I just witness what is in my mind or in front of me, or what I'm experiencing. Not so. There is something more to it. And that is that even as we are the witness, we recognize that that self, which is the witness, is all that exists. The reality is just that self. So this recognition, therefore, is born of all the teachings of our Guru, which are coming to us in a very subtle way. We don't have to actually recollect the words in so many different ways during meditation. Instead, all that we have grasped through the Guru's words get highlighted in essence, in ESSENCE, in essence, in that Nididhyasana. And so the first step, like I said, being a witness. Thoughts come, thoughts go. We remain the witness. And then, wonder of wonders, the aham sphurana arises, where I remain as the self, which is completeness, fullness of the nature of non-duality. That mind totally resolves. Instead of fighting with the mind and the thoughts, the mind has its resting place as the self. So that is Bhagavan's assurance, and also the acharyas, that during Nididhyasanam, one lets go of the sense of doership, even of being just a witness. So these two notions, that I am doing something, I have to do all of this, first you let go of that. And during meditation, first you practice that. And then going still further, we let go the notion that I am experiencing various things. So this is what happens during Nididhyasanam. It's not something you cultivate or form a concept of. So all this was experienced, or all this was explained in the previous question. And then we will go to question 12, which we had briefly seen, and then we will continue from where we did our study. So the disciple asks in this 12th question, is the self-experience possible even in the state of empirical existence or vyavahara for the mind which has to perform functions in accordance with its prarabdha? So the student is having a background. He feels, I have this prarabdha, I have to do so many roles in my life. And can I really own up this self-knowledge? That is a very valid and genuine question. But implicit in that question, as you can see, which Bhagavan later addresses, is that I have some prarabdha which I have to do. So there is a notion there. Later on, Bhagavan asks the student, that disciple, to question even that. Do you really have any prarabdha? Do you really have any duties which you have to do? So Bhagavan says, even that notion and then trying to overcome that, even that is taking us a little away from self-inquiry. But he comes to that later. But for now, Bhagavan goes along with the disciples saying, okay, your question is, can you be with the self? Can you be with the self-inquiry practice amidst all the roles you play, amidst these empirical transactions that you have to undergo? And Bhagavan says that just as a Brahmin may play various parts in a drama, yet the thought that he is a Brahmin does not leave his mind. Even similarly, when one is engaged in various empirical acts, there should be the firm conviction, I am the self, without allowing the false idea that I am the body to rise. And if the mind should stray away from its state, then immediately one should inquire, oh, we are not the body. Who are we? And thus one should reinstate the mind again in that pure state. So Bhagavan says, for sure it is possible to come back to that self-inquiry, even when these empirical transactions are going. And we saw how many of these transactions really have two components. One is, yes, which involves certain actions, but then there is also a great deal of energy wasted by our emotions, by our constant worrying and thinking and over planning more than what is objective. And so Bhagavan clearly could see that if we allow these roles to be played by us, to be played in a natural way, they do not displace self-inquiry or the spirit of being in the self. So self-inquiry in this particular case, it means the practice of being aware of oneself even amidst the roles we play. So that is not really going to go away if we do our roles the way they are to be done, without our ragadveshas and emotions coming in. What are ragadveshas? Our strong likes which say this should happen in this particular way. If it doesn't happen like that, we are likely to be upset. So our mind has that kind of a notion deep inside. So that notion engenders so many emotions, and those emotions prevent us from self-inquiry, not the very performance of the role. So if I have to just do some roles, Bhagavan is assuring us you will be able to do those roles with whatever effective involvement you need to have, provided you are able to address those deeper aspects where the mind comes up and creates this big narrative of suffering and sorrow or anxiety and worry. So those emotions are what are opposed to self-inquiry. And those are where we can try to do a little homework, bring in all the teachings, and draw the mind back to attention to the self. So that is the basic thinking which was expressed so beautifully here. And then Bhagavan goes on to say, the inquiry, who am I, is the principal means to the removal of all misery and attainment of the supreme bliss. When in this manner, the mind becomes quiescent in its own state, self-experience arises of its own accord without any hindrance. So Bhagavan is again reiterating that this who am I inquiry, or nididhyasanam as it's called, is the principal way to the removal of all misery. Because as long as any other actions are being done by us, we are not completely free of whatever is known as the aham bhavana or the ahankara. So the word ahankara is usually used neutrally, as opposed to how ahankara is regarded as a very negative word in, let's say, today's conventional use of that word. So here in Vedanta and in Bhagavan's teachings too, the ahankara, the aham vritti is a neutral word. It means that I am identified with the mind and body and I'm doing something. Let's say I'm just looking at a tree and then trying to take something from that tree. So there is ahankara involved even in that. It may not be laden with all the arrogance and the pride and so on, which are normally called ahankara. So even in the mere fact of doing something neutral and seeing something, there is the ahankara implicit in that. And so Bhagavan says that therefore, as long as that ahankara is there and who am I is not practiced, there is no real freedom from suffering or real freedom from distress. And so sometimes we get caught in trying to deal with the mind at the level of the mind. So there is a mind, we are having so many thoughts, emotions, some anxiety, some distress. And unless we are able to come to a little higher platform, a little higher plane, which is what Bhagavan is trying to nudge us towards, we will be caught up. As long as we are at the same level of a problem, we can not totally gain a certain ascendance and freedom from that problem. On the other hand, both the Acharyas, Bhagavan Sri Ramana and Sri Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, paradoxically give a very high level teaching up front, saying that you need to rise above the problem, come to a higher state or higher state of understanding and functioning. Then, yes, of course, you do deal with your situation. You don't run away. You don't try to be in denial about it. So you recognize whatever is happening to you, but you first come to a higher understanding, at least a glimpse of it, which is where that daily practice is so important for each one of us. That is where we are connecting and putting the teachings of Bhagavan into practice. Even if you are not 100% doing only self-inquiry, let us say you're doing a little mantra repetition initially, perfect, fine. And after that, you will naturally move into self-inquiry. But all of these practices are what are our astras. They are our weapons to fight the battle of life with all its challenges. And so Bhagavan reiterates, who am I is the principal means to removal of all misery. As long as that ahankara is there is no real solution to misery. And so therefore, we are asked to get that practice of coming back to oneself and creating that space between I and the mind. So the more we understand that I can create some space between myself, I, and the mind, which I use as an instrument, that space, if we are finding, that's where all the healing is there. That's where all the power, all the comfort is there. And so Bhagavan is drawing attention to that. And he goes on to say, when in this manner, the mind becomes quiescent in its own state, self-experience arises of its own accord without any hindrance. So Bhagavan is saying here that this mind, as you discover its quiescence, how does the quiescence of the mind come? So I stop using the mind at least for a while. For a while, I develop the capacity to suspend my use of the mind. Remember, there are two ways of putting this. You could say, stop all the thoughts. Well, that's one way of saying it, but that becomes another action. I am trying to stop one part of myself. So I am at odds with myself. So that becomes a little tricky there. And so Bhagavan generally would say that you come back to yourself, inquire who's the doer, inquire who's the thinker, inquire to whom these thoughts are all occurring. And so there what happens is that the mind becomes quiescent in its own state and self-experience arises of its own accord without any hindrance. So instead of suppressing the thoughts, you instead create space between you and the thoughts. So in self-inquiry, that's exactly what is happening, that you're not actually trying to say the thoughts should not come. Instead, you just say, let the thoughts come. Who or what is the thinker of those thoughts? Who or what am I? So that's how you create that space between you and the mind. And so as this practice becomes deeper, that self, which is understood as not just a thinker, not just the experiencer, is appreciated as non-dual. It's an automatic arising of the vritti in response to all the earlier teaching and words of the Guru, remember that. So in response to that, in this sadhana of self-inquiry, the self-experience or that the self is not a small self just looking at a mind. Instead, it is non-dual. It's not that I have one self and you have another self or somebody else has another self. There are no multiple selves. Instead, the self is non-dual. That very appreciation becomes so much more easier to arrive at by this self-inquiry practice. And then Bhagavan goes on to say, thereafter, sensory pleasures and pains will not affect the mind. All phenomena will appear then without attachment like a dream. So this is the connection with the question. So Bhagavan says, the more I am able to stay with self-inquiry, the more I am able to find that absence of attachment, that experience of all these empirical roles and empirical objects without getting involved, without getting attached to these states of experience externally. So all phenomena will appear then like a dream. So what happens in a dream? You know that you are the entire dream. The dream mountains, who created the dream mountains? You yourself have created them. Who created the dream flowers and the dream stones and the dream people, even including your dream body? So all of that was the great creative power of the self manifesting through the mind and its memories. The very memories, the samskaras, in the light of the self, get projected out into a three-dimensional world in dream. And so we are not attached to a dream if you know that it's a dream. Okay, assuming you know it's a dream, you are not going to be attached or afraid of the objects in the dream. Closer to what today many would call a lucid dream. And this word is used. A lucid dream is one in which you are aware, okay, this is a dream. And then you could even do various things, knowing that it's a dream. You would take some liberties. You might want to just go and start flying or jumping out from a height. You know very well nothing is going to happen. So those kind of lucid dreams are an example of someone who knows that it is a dream while in the dream. Okay? Rarely it comes, but that's a helpful experience if you have had it, to keep at that as an analogy for how a person given to self-inquiry will gradually see this very world experience like a dream, okay, as Bhagavan says. Never forgetting one's plenary self-experience is the real bhakti, yoga, jnana, and all other austerities. Thus say the sages. So Bhagavan, again, it was totally one. He had become one with that self, and yet he says, thus say the sages. Very sweetly he says, aligning his vision with all the sages, he says, never forgetting that plenary experience. What is plenary? Plenary is that which includes everything else. It's the general, most general experience of pure being. So that self-experience is real bhakti, yoga, jnana, and all other austerities. Remember, the word experience, when used in the context of Bhagavan, in the context of Advaita, which is a translation of the Sanskrit word anubhava, it doesn't mean objectifying the self. Okay? It's not some sound and lights and something spectacular coming up in your vision. It's not any experience of that kind. Instead, it is when the mind itself steps back and resolves. So the word experience is a misnomer, but we have no better word to capture the idea that in the wake of self-inquiry or aham brahmasmi meditation, that mind gently resolves into its source. So for lack of a better word, we use words such as the vritti or the aham spurana or self-experience. These are all referring to that same process where the mind just steps away, stops obstructing what you truly are. So that is all referred to here as the samam vamam, or the very total, the highest possible state of mind. And people call it the very acme of bhakti, yoga, and jnana. It is bhakti because it is one in which we become one with the object of love, which is really the self. In the very well-known conversation between Yajnavalkya and Maitreyi mentioned in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. So Maitreyi, who was a very advanced and a very committed sadhaka, she asks the husband who is going away to take sannyasa. And the husband says, look, I have this property. I shall give all this property over to you. And you can stay with the ashram or their gurukula. And Maitreyi says, yes, you're welcome to leave. She is no longer so feeble or so dependent on him. She gives him the full freedom, but then she says, what is the use of this wealth you are giving me? And you are going away seeking or committed to something else. So what is it that you are going for, leaving aside all this wealth? And what can I do with this wealth? And Yajnavalkya says that it is Atman alone which is the reality, which is that which everybody seeks, and that Atman will not be obtained by this wealth. Vritti is not going to give you the self. So wealth, therefore, when Maitreyi is told, is not going to give self-knowledge. She says, I have no use for that wealth. And then Yajnavalkya explains to Maitreyi, Atmanastu kamaya sarvam priyam bhavati. It is for the sake of the self that everything is dear to you. Not anything is an end in itself. Patyuh kamaya pati priyam bhavati. It is not for the sake of the husband that the wife really loves the husband. It is for the sake of the self that the husband is dear to the wife. It is not for the sake of the wife that the wife is dear to the husband. It is for the sake of the self that the wife is dear to the husband. In this way, he goes on reiterating that idea beautifully in those verses there. What that implies is that whenever a given object or a person or a relationship or a situation evokes that pleased self in you, you like that object. You will try to want more of that object. If a given person evokes that pleased self, then you want to be around that person. You want to always have that person. If any object does that to you, you want to have that object and possess it. So, but beyond the obvious problem in having a dependence on that, what we recognize is, what is that object or person actually doing to you? And we say it is just evoking the self in the way that that self truly is. It makes you feel or experience the pleased self. Normally, that self which I constantly experience is experienced as something limited, something inadequate. And whereas that person, that object makes me feel adequate, makes me feel whole, complete. And so therefore, Yajnavalkya there highlights that therefore the object only evokes what you truly are. It only tells you that you are of that nature of fullness and wholeness. It is a reminder of what you are. That's why you love that object or that person or situation. And so this very essence is bhakti as well. In bhakti, you experience or see that oneness with the Lord. Normally what happens is people go to a temple, they experience something nice. They feel a certain quietness there. That's wonderful. That's very worthy. That shows a sattvic frame of mind. At the same time, let's say there's a person who goes all the way to a great Himalayan shrine like Badrinath. There he is, even if he were to be a dualist who is fully committed to bhakti, he has a lot of love or bhakti for the Lord. He goes to this faraway shrine, and when he reaches the shrine, after a minute, he closes his eyes. He is labeled, Indian style at least, close his eyes and join his palms. Why does he close his eyes? Why does he close his eyes? Because he feels that oneness right there and then in his heart. If that Lord was really outside, he should be only keeping the eyes open. But it is often found where there is sufficient time, especially, that after the initial looking at a temple, looking at the Lord, even that bhakta closes his eyes, just reliving, staying with that oneness. And so therefore, even in bhakti, if we look what is the essence of that bhakti, there is oneness with the object of devotion. There is a hint of that oneness even in the so-called dualistic bhakti. And so Bhagavan is drawing attention to that here, saying that even the real bhakti is the same result of self-experience, or is the same as self-experience, which is the result of self-inquiry. And so then again, yoga, mind control. So when the mind is truly controlled, it resolves as the self. So there is no other way. In fact, Sri Shankara Bhagavat Pada, in his commentary on the Mandukya Upanishad, mentions that controlling the mind is not possible without self-knowledge. So it becomes a vicious circle. Unless you control the mind, you cannot get self-knowledge. And only in the wake of self-knowledge, the mind will have nirodha or control. And so what is the way out? Therefore, Shankara says, have a relative degree of control called Antakaran Shuddhi, which is a certain degree of quiescence and quietness, and where you're not really dealing with something very problematic in the mind. The mind, when it has that relative quietness, then the jnana or pursuit of knowledge and self-inquiry has to take over. Otherwise, we are caught in that circle. I have to quieten the mind, I have to quieten the mind, and more I have to quieten the mind. So instead, with whatever little quietness we have, if we are able to connect with the teaching of Bhagavan with self-inquiry, so be it. Let us not be a perfectionist, is the idea given there of hunting for this antakaran shuddhi or pure state of mind, which is like a mirage, which keeps going further away from you. If we do not pursue self-inquiry, like I said, a certain degree of antakaran shuddhi is very important, but with whatever is available, one can still pursue self-inquiry. With whatever quietness, whatever little summoning up of a certain quiet state of mind is possible for a person in his meditation, if not at other times, self-inquiry can still be resorted to. In fact, the very fact that many of us come to Bhagavan, come to Advaita in different ways, indicates that we are to a certain extent able to relate to this. And so therefore, we are not ever denied self-inquiry altogether. And Bhagavan here puts it even more strongly, saying, therefore, this self-knowledge born of self-inquiry is the very essence of yoga or mind control as well. And knowledge, jnana, of course, that is the essence of self-inquiry and all other austerities. So this very notion that the highest tapas is jnanamayam tapaha is reiterated here by Bhagavan, saying that so many austerities are possible in the form of the regular, well-known practices such as fasting or staying awake late at night or doing a lot of mantra repetition. All those are wonderful and validated, but self-inquiry and the glimpses of self-knowledge that you have, and then going along with that practice of self-knowledge, is the highest of all austerities, says Bhagavan here. Thus say the sages. So Bhagavan is aligning and validating what the sages have said in this context. And then we will go to the next question here. The 13th question is what we are going to now read. When there is activity in regard to works, this is the question of the disciple. When there is activity in regard to works, we are neither the agents of those works nor their enjoyers. The activity is of the three instruments, that is the mind, speech, and body. Could we remain unattached, thinking thus? So when the question is asked, sometimes we might find the question to be quite correct and valid, and the answer should probably be a yes, is what we might expect at first glance. But Bhagavan, the great enlightened jnani, one with Ishvara as he was, is able to see more deeply than the first level meaning of that question. So the disciple is asking that I shall remain unattached by thinking in this way constantly, that I am not the agent or the doer, I am not the enjoyer. The activity is going on at the mind and the speech and the body level. So I'll keep thinking like this, and thus I will be unattached. Isn't this very desirable, is what he's asking. But Bhagavan sees that there is something missing. He's just falling short, the disciple there. And so he wants to push him still further into self-inquiry. Bhagavan says, after the mind has been made to stay in the self, which is its deity, and has been rendered indifferent to empirical matters, because it does not stray away from the self, how can the mind think as mentioned above? Do not such thoughts constitute bondage? When such thoughts arise due to the vasanas, one should restrain the mind from flowing that way and endeavor to retain it in the self state and make it turn indifferent to empirical matters. One should not give room in the mind for such thoughts such as, is this good? Is that good? Can this be done or can that be done? Instead, one should be vigilant even before such thoughts arise and make the mind stay in its native state. So Bhagavan here as you can see, says, look, if you go on thinking like that, that itself is born of the vasanas. So thinking in certain ways is not really the essence of self-inquiry. If you keep, a person has to go on thinking, I'm not the doer, I'm not the enjoyer, whatever is happening is at the level of the mind. So in some subtle way, if this kind of a thought is continuing in the background, that mind is not going to resolve there. And so although it might seem like a nice way of feeling unattached or detached or unaffected by what is going on, Bhagavan says, not so. Instead, he says, endeavor to retain the mind in the self state. So this is something very significant here. So we are not therefore asked to do something in the form of negating what is in front of you, which may be good as an initial practice, but there's something more, which is to endeavor to retain the mind in the self state, which is what we call Atma Vichara, self-inquiry, Nididhyasanam. All of them are the same thing. That mind remains as the self. So that's where a certain breakthrough, no doubt, we need, we can say. Till then, of course, we are at the level of the mind, trying to withdraw the mind from these thoughts, saying, these thoughts are coming, but who or what am I? So that is the first level where you're turning your mind or attention away from the thoughts and remaining as a thinker. That stage is there initially, where you have to, in a sense, keep a certain push and pull with the mind there. But there is more to it, where one shouldn't think that itself is the last stage in self-inquiry. Instead, Bhagavan clearly says that we just, instead of trying to reason about these thoughts, reason about what is happening when I think those thoughts, instead, I allow those thoughts, ignore those thoughts, turn the mind back to that very thinker, to its source, and remain as the self. So that's where a small distinction is there between being like a witness to the thoughts and saying, I'm not the thinker, I'm not even enjoying these experiences, I'm not the karta or bhokta, not mere negation there, but remaining as the self. So that's the subtle difference between making it kind of witnessing of what is happening, which is good as an initial step, but there is more to it. After remaining as a witness, that very mind resolves as the self. That is the whole second significant step of Atma Vichara. That is when it becomes what is known as Nididhyasanam. And then Bhagavan also says, don't go on reasoning, is this good, is that good, can this be done, can that be done? So at the level of discriminating what I should be doing or what are healthy thoughts and so on, we are still operating at the level of the thoughts and mind. So a lot of this thinking can sound very nice. It can sound very quote unquote spiritual. But Bhagavan says that itself is a kind of vasana, and it will take us away from what Bhagavan calls the self state. Okay, the self state is what in Bhagavad Gita, if you recollect, would be mentioned as Atma Samstham Manaha. So it's no doubt you can call it a state in the sense of how we always think everything is a state. But that is a state in which the mind is no longer present, actively thinking its thoughts. Instead, we have just remained still, allowing the thoughts to subside. And there is this moment or moments of total abidance, where all that exists is seen, appreciated without any thinking process as that non-dual awareness, which is not in time, not in space. That is the Atma Samstham Manaha. So that's what Bhagavan calls as Aham Sphurana in other contexts. Here in English, Sri T.M.P. Mahadevan, the translator, uses the word the self state. So the Atma Samstham Manaha, where space and time themselves are seen as just concepts that arise and fall in awareness. That awareness which you have today, here and now, is not different from that awareness which was there yesterday. In fact, even when yesterday was experienced by you, it was experienced as now alone. The present moment alone is what is experienced. You never experience the past. You never experience anything called future. So all of that is implicit. All of that is implicit in this pregnant word self-state. So in that Atma Samstham Manaha, that mind, not in the stream of time, not at any point in space. Instead, space itself is in the self or awareness, and that self you come back to. You come back to because at other times you are carried away by the content of your thoughts and you lose sight of that non-dual self. And here, coming back to that self is what is done, not reasoning more and more about the contents of the mind and its various preoccupations. So although those kind of thinking might seem correct, Bhagavan says, no, there's more to it. And so then Bhagavan goes on to say, one should be vigilant even before any such thoughts arise and make the mind stay in its native state. If any little room is given for the mind, such a disturbed mind will do harm to us while posing as our friend. Like the foe appearing to be a friend, it will topple us down. Is it not because one forgets oneself that such thoughts arise and cause more and more evil? While it is true that to think through discrimination that I do not do anything, all actions are performed by the instruments. This is a means to prevent the mind from flowing along the thought vasanas. Does it not also follow that only if the mind flows along the thought vasanas, that it must be restrained through discrimination, as stated before? Can the mind that remains in the self state think as I, and as I behave empirically, thus and thus, in all ways, manner of ways possible, one should endeavor gradually not to forget one's self, that is God. So that is Bhagavan's conclusion. He rhetorically, Bhagavan asks that already our mind has taken a few steps along the path, along the vasanas, and taken itself to be doer, got little involved with its thoughts and memories and planning and so on. That is when we have to say, okay, I am not the doer, I am not, the result enjoyer of all of this and so on. So he says, while it is true that this way of discrimination is a means to prevent the mind from flowing along thought vasanas, so Bhagavan validates that, okay, that's true, that's not harmful, it's good. But that happens if already the cat is out of the bag, so to speak. Already the mind has come up and got identified with n number of things. And so therefore it is wise sometimes, after doing this discrimination, maybe for a while, maybe for a few minutes, however, at some point, this good practice also has to be gone deeper into to arrive at the self, which is a priori. Awareness, remember, is a priori. What is a priori? Before even any thought arises, awareness is. Before I am a doer, I am an enjoyer of any particular thought, awareness is. So one has to remind oneself of that real nature of the self. So Bhagavan says, without forgetting the self state, one has to remain there. Which is why this discrimination is a good way of analyzing and withdrawing from the content of the thoughts that are coming up. But really, one should recognize, hey, my mind has already gotten out and got involved in all of this, which is why I am doing all this discrimination. So at some point, one has to snap out of it, take a complete break from that very mind, which is even doing this discrimination, and come back and just say, let the mind, which is pure awareness, which is not in the stream of thoughts, which is not in time, not in space, what is that I? And come back to that self. In some way or the other, one has to deviate or let not the mind carry us into its stories, and in a jiffy come back to oneself. Okay. Remember, there's no other verbalization. Even this very explanation of the kind that I am pure awareness, I am not in time, not in space, is an underlying understanding which is already there. In a jiffy, in a single mental mode, that self experiences again renewed or refreshed. So Bhagavan therefore says, without forgetting the self state, one has to come back. So in one moment, as it were, is what it takes for the mind to just come back and say, aha, I am that awareness, which is what it is. So that's what Bhagavan says. Don't get into analyzing all the various thoughts and their content. So in all manner of ways possible, one should endeavor gradually not to forget oneself, that is God. If that is accomplished, all will be accomplished, says Bhagavan. The mind should not be directed to any other matter. Even though one may perform like a mad person the actions that are the result of prarabdha karma, one should retain the mind in the self state without letting the thought I do arise, that I am a doer, karta. Have not countless bhaktas performed their numerous empirical duties with an attitude of indifference? So Bhagavan is asking, for sure, all the devotees have performed their roles which are there very spontaneously. They didn't indulge in a lot of fighting with the mind. Is this my prarabdha? Is this what I should be doing? Maybe I should not do this. I'm not the doer. I'm not the enjoyer. They don't have to keep on quarreling with the mind. So there is a breakthrough, as it were, in their attitude of surrender to Ishvara, in their attitude of surrender to the very nature of the self. The self and the mind will do its activities spontaneously. A person doesn't have to keep on having doubts about what his roles are, about doubts about what he should be doing. So Bhagavan therefore says, instead of going on thinking what I should do, what I should not do, which is good or bad, like those bhaktas, they just completely immerse their mind in Ishvara in the case of the bhaktas. And Bhagavan here is saying that that self, which is the deity of the mind. So just as deity here means the very source, the very sustainer of the mind is the self. So just come back to the self is a definite practice which is possible for every one of us. That is Bhagavan's assurance here. Then the devotee goes on to say or ask, what is the real purpose of sannyasa or renunciation? So we'll see this question in detail in the next class. We will just give a brief overview today. So Bhagavan says that sannyasa is only the renunciation of the I thought and not the rejection of the external objects. He who has renounced the I thought thus remains the same whether he is alone or in the midst of the extensive samsara. Just as when the mind is concentrated on some object, it does not observe other things even though they may be proximate. So also, although the sage may perform any number of empirical acts, in reality he performs nothing, because he makes the mind rest in the self without letting the I thought arise. Even as in a dream, one appears to fall head downwards, while in reality one is unmoving, so also the ignorant person, that is the person for whom the I thought has not ceased, although he remains alone in constant meditation, is in fact the one who performs all empirical actions. Thus the wise ones have said. So Bhagavan is saying two different ideas here, one after the other. So first he says, sannyasa is the renunciation of the I thought. What is the I thought? So the best way you or I can relate to the I thought is, whenever a person does many things with the notion I am doing things, the I thought is available or is present. Whenever he says, I am seeing something, I experience this, I thought is there. So these two notions of being a doer and being an enjoyer are continuously present unless you step back from the mind, create that space through self-inquiry between yourself and the mind. That's when that I thought is temporarily weakened and then it resolves. So otherwise, I thought always gets ammunition, fuel from your identification and doing these roles with a sense of reality. And that I thought gets weakened as you step back from it and resolve into awareness or resolve as awareness. As awareness, I always am that, but that awareness plus this notion of a doer is what is normally there. And so Bhagavan says, therefore, in the midst of the extensive samsara, that I thought is superfluous. The various external objects can allow to be there. They are not the source of our distress. It is the I thought which goes and identifies and demands and wants all these external objects. That creates the problem. So Bhagavan is quite emphatic here, saying that let's not blame the world. Let's not blame the people around us. Instead, this I thought which constantly makes plans. The I thought is a very abstract word. So always see the I thought in relation to what you are likely to have most importance for in your life. So the I thought for, let's say, a very committed professional would be, I am a doctor or I am a businessman. So the I am is followed by some identity, right? That is what the I thought, most of it is vested in. And so if that role is temporarily withdrawn in meditation, in self-inquiry, that I thought will get weakened. Good for him. And so that's what Bhagavan is here saying, that who has renounced the I thought, for that jnani, the external objects will be there. They are not a problem. But he remains the same, whether he's alone, without involvement in various roles, or whether the extensive samsara is there, he's in the midst of that. It's very instructive that the external objects are never a source of our distress. It bears repetition again and again, because we are always liable to trace the source of our distress and of our feeling of being inadequate to something external to us. That is never the case, because the great jnanis, forget about even the jnanis, even those who are on the path, they are able to own up responsibility for our emotions and say, like, it's my mind which is creating these emotions, not the situation. The situation may be pleasant. Yes, I recognize it as pleasant. It may be unpleasant. And of course, I recognize it as unpleasant. I am not in denial about it. I don't try to mix up and say, no, everything is fine. Not so. But even in an unpleasant situation, I recognize that these emotions that I have that are distressing, distressful, are created by this I thought in conjunction with my memories and thoughts and plans and expectations and so on. So this I thought is superfluous. The mind can very effectively do the roles it needs to play, even without this I and the distressful emotions. That's the big message here, that let us not blame the external world and our situation. Instead, if we are able to even practice a little bit of this kind of self-inquiry, preceded no doubt by our mantra and so on, it will be a great help and a great effective tool to create that space between I and the roles that I play. And so that is why the sage may perform any number of empirical acts, but in reality, he performs nothing, because he makes the mind rest in the self without letting this I thought arise. Okay, for him, for the person who is already a jnani, of course, the I thought is completely superfluous. For you or me, we can discover that space in meditation. We can discover that space in self-inquiry actively, sit quietly, give some time to yourself, and let the mind be for a while and come back to being that self. Use mantra if necessary, but the more you're able to find that space between you, the more the I thought will be weakened. That is the message here of Bhagavan. Thus the wise ones have said. Okay? We will look into more details of this in the next class, and we will end with the Shanti mantra for today. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om. Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Hari Om.
Namo Ramana Raghavji. Thank you.
Namo Ramana.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. I shall now request Narayananji at the shrine to take over, and please continue with Akshar Madamalai and Aarti. Narayananji.
Yes, sir. அருணாச்சலவரற்கேற்ற அக்ஷரமணமாலை சாற்ற அருணாகர கணபதியே அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல 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 அகமே நினைப்பவராக நிறைவேறார் அருணாச்சல அழகு சுந்தரம் அகமுனியுற்று இன்னமயிருக்கும் அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அகம்புகுந்தீர்க்கும் அககுகை சிறையாய் அமர்வித்ததென் கொல் அருணாச்சலா ஆருக்காயனை ஆண்டனை அகற்றி தினம் வழித்திடும் அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா இப்பழித்தனை நினைத்தால் இனி யார் விடுவார் அருணாச்சலா ஈன்றிடும் மன்னை பெரிதருள் கூடிகொள் இதுவும் உனதருள் அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா முனையே மாற்றி ஓரா உள்ளத்தின் மேல் உறுதியாயிருப்பார் அருணாச்சலா ஊரம்பிடம் உன்னை கண்டு அடங்கி உன்னழகை காட்டருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா என்னை அழித்திப்போ என்னை கலவாவிடில் இதுவோ ஆண்மை அருணாச்சலா ஏறிந்த உறக்கம் என்னை பிறருக்க இது உனக்கழகும் அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா ஐம்புல கள்வர் அகத்தினில் புகுவோ அகத்தில் இல்லையோ அருணாச்சலா ஒருவன் நாம் உன்னை பொழித்தவர் வருவார் தூவே இது அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா ஓங்காரம் ஒரு உயர்வில்லொய் உனையாரறிவார் அருணாச்சலா அவ்வை போல எனக்கும் அருளை தந்து ஆழ்வது உன் கடனாச்சலா அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல 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 சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சலம் வாழி அன்பர்களும் வாழி शरवण भावे वाणी भूर्भुवस्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो न प्रचोदयात्। स्वाहा ओम प्राणाय स्वाहा ओम अपाने ज्ञानाय स्वाहा उदानाय स्वाहा ओम समानाय स्वाहा ब्रह्मणे स्वाहा ओम नमो भगवते चरणाथ रमणाय नमः ओम भगवते चरणाथ रमणाय नमः चरणाथ रमणाय कात्याय नमः मृगाय नमः देवाय नमः सुब्रह्मण्याय नमः स्वामीनाथाय नमः दक्षिणामूर्तये नमः नटराजाय नमः भैरवाय नमः नंदीमहेश्वराय नमः शिवपार्वतीये नमः ओम नमः शिवाय नमः नमः शिवाय नमः नमः शिवाय नमः नमः शिवाय नमः गोशीरं निवेद्यं समर्पयामि मध्ये पानीयं समर्पयामि दुग्धं समर्पयामि नीराजनं समर्पयामि नीराजनं कर्मासवनीयं समर्पयामि उद्दीपन समायुक्तं नागवल्ली चलिवर्गं कर्पूर्ण सूर्णसंस्थं प्रसिद्धं कर्पूर नीराजनं श्रीरङ्गमं सिद्धि समर्पयामि। यो भाव पुष्पं वेद पुष्पवान् प्रजावान् पशुमान् भवति चन्द्रमा वामां पुष्पं पुष्पं पुष्पवान् प्रजावान् पशुमान् भवति ओम तत् ब्रह्मा ओम तत् वायु ओम तत् आत्मा ओम तत् सत्यम ओम तत् सर्वम ओम तत् गुरु नमः अंतःकरणे भूतेषु भुवायां विश्वमूर्तिषु त्वं यज्ञत्वं वसत्कार त्वं मित्रत्वं रुद्रत्वं विष्णुत्वं ब्रह्मत्वं प्रजापति ओम तथा वो ज्योतिरत्वं ब्रह्मपुत्रं न कर्मणा न प्रजयागने नित्यानैके अमृतत्वमानसु परेणनाहं नीतं भुवायं विभ्राजते गत्यदयो विसन्ति वेदांत विज्ञान से नित्यदाता संन्यास योगाचलय शुद्ध तत्वा ते ब्रह्मलोके तु परान्तकाले परामृतात् परिमुच्यन्ति सर्वे तारं निपापं परमेत्मभूतं यत् पुण्डरीकं प्रपद्य तकुंसतं तत्रादित्यगणं दिशोकं तस्मिन् यदन्तं तदुपादित्यं यो वेदातो स्वरब्रह्मो वेदान्तसत्यं तस्य प्रकृतिलीनस्य परतमहेश्वरः मंत्रपुष्पं के रमणमन्नित्यं मंत्रपुष्पं कात्याय मुरुगावल्ली देवानित्यं मंत्रपुष्पं सुब्रह्मण्य स्वामीनाथन दक्षिणामूर्ति नटराजत्वं मंत्रपुष्पं भैरव नंदीमहेश्वर शिवपार्वतीत्यं समर्पयामि। ओम सत्संगर्पणमस्तु। हरि ओम हरि ओम हरि ओम।
Namo Ramana. This brings us to the closure of today's satsang with Raghavji. We shall meet Raghavji again on fourth Sunday of next month. Namo Ramana.